So if there's one thing that levels all humans, it doesn't matter who we are, the life we've lived, the accomplishments that we've had, one thing levels us, and that's death. We can't escape it, even though humans have been trying to escape death since the beginning of time. Some of the earliest stories that we have from human civilization, and we'll go back to the earliest civilization that we believe, so whenever humans started to live together and create cities and civilize, if you think back to social studies back in school, we think that was ancient Mesopotamia, which is the Fertile Crescent there in the Middle East. And from that region, we have stories about life. And from those stories, there's one story specifically that there's a human that pursues immortality, only to learn that humans are mortal. And in that world, what they believed is when you died, your shadow, they called it, there was just a shadow, like a shadow of your true self, went to the underworld or went to live under the earth. So this is actually the way that the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, talks about life. It talks about people going to Sheol after they die, and this is place of the shadowy world of life after death. Now in ancient Egypt, there they developed the process of making mummies. All of us have heard about the mummies of ancient Egypt. The reason they did that was because they believed that somehow humans lived into the grave, and so they preserved the body. And they also believed that somehow that body and the soul, the life force, lived on afterwards in the afterlife, in some sort of spiritual sense. And when we go to ancient Greece, this is probably the ancient idea that we're most familiar with, even if we don't realize it. Because this way of thinking is so shaped even Western culture. In ancient Greece, there was the underworld that was ruled by Hades. So Hades was the name. The other name, I don't know, does anybody know? It's one of our planets. It's not Jupiter, it might be Saturn or Neptune. I think it's Neptune. Pluto? Is Pluto is Pluto? Okay, I trust you, Tyler. So Hades is the Roman name. Pluto is the Greek name of the same god who rules the underworld. So if you've seen the movie Hercules, the animated one, there's the guy with the blue flames, and he is Hades. He rules the underworld. And so in that way of thinking, when you die, the soul, now the way we think of a soul really comes from the ancient Greeks. It's actually not a Bible idea. And that's why we need to push away from the ancient soul idea. But the soul was like this part of you that was disembodied from the rest of you. And it went to the underworld, and it had to make the journey through the river Styx. So if you like the band Styx, that's where the name comes from. This river that you had to ride on. And you had to be able to pay the fare. So when someone died, they would put a coin in their mouth so that they could then make the journey to the underworld. So this was the way that the Greeks thought about it. Ancient Rome basically took all of those ideas and kind of just pasted them into their way of thinking. And that's why we have both Roman and Greek names for all of the same gods. They kind of just pushed it all together. So the question is, what do we believe about death? And where does the ideas of death in our culture come from? Now, Christianity has shaped the way we think about death, but also Greek thought has shaped the way that Christians came to think about death in the Middle Ages. And so what I want to say is we need to go back to the New Testament and even further back to the Old Testament to really see what the Bible has to say to us about death. So All Saints Day, like I said, it's this day in the calendar where we, one, remember people who have passed away recently and also since the beginning, and also we think about the story of life and death. And so today we're going to be looking at several texts, most specifically John 11:32 through 44. So if you want to take out the Pew Bible and follow along, it will also be on the screen. John 11, verse 32, it starts on page number 1530. So I'm going to turn there, but really you can follow along on the screen. But if you want to follow along in the Pew Bible, 1530, John chapter 11, starting in verse 32. Let's take a look at this story today. So this is how it starts. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." All right, this is the beginning of one of the more famous stories in the Gospel of John. Now, we need to have a little bit of background to understand what's going on. So Mary is in this story right here. Mary has a sister named Martha, and she has a brother named Lazarus. So these are three people who are friends with Jesus. They live in the city, or it's a town called Bethany. It's about 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. And so whenever Jesus would come to Jerusalem, they would go through Bethany and most likely stay with Martha and Mary and Lazarus, and then finish the journey into Jerusalem. And so these are people that Jesus knows well. Earlier in the Gospel of John, Jesus receives word that Lazarus, her brother, is sick. And so Jesus and his disciples start to make the journey to go back to Bethany. But before they get there, Mary meets Jesus at the entrance of the city or the town, and she gives him the bad news that it's too late, that Lazarus has already died. And so this is Jesus' response. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. So Jesus gets there, and it's not just Mary, but it's the whole town who's mourning Lazarus. And so they're all following Mary, and they all see her meet Jesus. And Jesus looks at these people, and he sees the deep hurt and pain because Lazarus has passed away. And what Jesus asks is, he says, "Show me the grave." Now, before we go any further, what we need to acknowledge right now is that death is just part of the human experience. We will encounter death at some point, if we haven't already. And if you've ever come to a funeral, what I point out is, for all of us, in the back of our minds, we know that death is looming at the end of the road. Death is part of life. Even for Jesus, when he was on this earth, he was also touched by death. It's the shared tragedy of the human life. We form close relationships with those around us. We form relationships with people we love, but all of us face death. And so Jesus wants to go to the tomb because Lazarus is his friend. When he gets to the tomb, this is what happens. Jesus wept. This is for the fun Bible trivia, the shortest verse in the Bible. I have to look. It's either 1 or 2 words. It's probably 2 words since Jesus is there. But it's the shortest verse. He wept. So Jesus also knows what it feels like to experience death. He understands the emotion of it. The feeling of loss and pain, the anger, the frustration that comes along with death. He knows. He's experienced it. He had people in his life whom he lost. And in this story, it's Lazarus, his dear friend. So when we have lost somebody, we know that Jesus is right there with us, and he's experienced it. Also, look what he does. He weeps. We have permission to experience the emotion of death. We don't have to stand there and be like, it's okay, he's in a better place. We can feel better. We know that he's resting. We can feel that, but we can still feel the pain of loss because Jesus did. Because death is a tragedy. And this is what Jesus does next, verse 36. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" So right a couple of chapters before, Jesus heals a blind man, and it really gets him some trouble. And the reason he has to leave Bethany and leave Lazarus is because people are trying to arrest him. And now he's back, and people say, wait a minute, isn't this the guy we just saw heal people? Why wasn't he here? Could he have helped Lazarus? So they see that Jesus cares, but also there's this looming question. Was it too late for Jesus to help Lazarus? Right here is where most of the world is. Most of the world's religions accept death. They accept that death is just part of life. They accept that there's no getting around death. So even the cultures and the religions that have a strong idea of afterlife, it's never an afterlife in our bodies. It's an afterlife that's away from here. It's not on the earth. It's not part of our life here. It's disconnected. It's somewhere else. And there's that question of, will we ever actually remember here? Will we ever know of what was going on? Will we know people in the life after? But But is this what the Bible says about death? Were Jesus' hands actually tied with Lazarus? Or could he do something about it? Verse 38. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." So I mentioned earlier that there's Mary and there's Lazarus and then there's Martha. Martha is the other sister. So now Martha enters the story. Jesus wants them to open the grave. And Martha says, "Wait a minute, Jesus. He's been there for 4 days." This is before embalming. They wrap the body in linen and they put spices on it to kind of cover the smell. But you sit in a grave in the Middle East for 4 days, just in a cave. It's in the side of a mountain, but it's not like you're in somewhere where it's really cold. You can imagine how it's going to be when they open that tomb. So Martha's like, "Why will we do this?" And this is Jesus' response. It's verse 40. "Then Jesus said, 'Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?'" And so now here comes the question. The question that he asks Martha and Mary and all those people there that day. Is it possible that Jesus has power over death? Is it possible that he can help Lazarus? So all of us today, what we need to ask ourselves is, do we believe that God has power over death? Do we actually believe that? Do we believe that his power over death will one day be displayed in glory? That's what we're going to talk about here in a moment, about the glory. Before that, though, let's see how this story ends. Verse 41. "So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, 'Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me.' When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, 'Lazarus, come out.' The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, 'Take off the grave clothes and let him go.'" So Jesus commands Lazarus to come out of the grave. And he does. He comes out and he's still wrapped in those linens, the grave cloth. Think about in the cartoons when you used to see mummies. The mummies would be all wrapped up in those like cloths and running around. So imagine that guy coming out of the tomb. It's obvious to everybody, Lazarus has been in that tomb. He's been dead. They wrapped him up. He was in there, sealed for 4 days. But now Jesus comes along and he has power over death. And so what we need to get straight is one thing. What this is called, now this is technical and I'm sorry, but I just want to make sure we understand. This is called a revivification. I might have added an extra syllable in there. A revivification. He's been revived. So what that means is that Lazarus was dead and he's been revived as if he had never died. So one day he will die again. It's different than what is coming later in the Gospel of John with Jesus. But right here in John's Gospel, we see the Father has given Jesus the power over death. So for any questions that might have been there about the power that Jesus has, that power has been displayed. Lazarus is only the beginning. Because what Jesus alludes to here in the rest of his gospel is there's a day coming when he also will be raised from the dead. This is just the beginning of what will happen. And so what this story shows is that death has no power over our God. That's what we need to know about death. Death has no power over our God. But this leads to another question. If God has power over death, does he have power to defeat death? Not just to have power over it, but can he eradicate it from the world? So now let's turn again to this Isaiah passage that we looked at earlier. Isaiah 25, 6-9. "On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. On this mountain, he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove his people's disgrace from all the earth. The Lord has spoken. In that day they will say, surely this is our God. We trust in him, and he saved us. This is the Lord. We trusted in him. Let us rejoice and be glad in his salvation. Now, Isaiah is a book that contains a number of different ideas. One of the main ideas of Isaiah is judgment. Judgment against Israel and judgment against the nations. Now, to understand Isaiah, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. In the beginning, God made the world, and then humans rebelled. And that introduced pain and suffering, evil and death. And so in chapter 11 of Genesis, we have this story, you might have heard it called the story of Babel. Humans unite in rebellion against God, and they say, we're going to build this tower into the heavens. We're going to become like God. And so they start to do this. God looks and he sees that for humans to be united is dangerous for them. And so he scatters the nations. And from that moment on, the nations are scattered. And he says to one nation, to one man, Abraham, I'm going to make out of you a nation to save all nations. And so the judgment against the nations is God saying, you need to return to me. So after, if you read the just verses or chapters before this in Isaiah, there's all these judgments against all these nations. All these oracles or like prophecy sayings about judgment. And then Isaiah says, but look, on this mountain, God will prepare a feast for all peoples. A day is coming when there will be a banquet to celebrate God becoming king again. A coronation banquet. And at this banquet, there will be salvation. And we will celebrate specifically victory over death. And so this forms the Old Testament understanding of how we should think about death. One day God will defeat death. And one day he will welcome the nations back to him. So this is the story on his holy mountain. Death has no power over our God. God's desire isn't just to keep death at bay. His desire is to defeat death, to set the world free from it. So now we go to our passage from Revelation. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. He said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Now, Jerusalem is a city on a hill. That's what it was called. And it literally, if you've been to the Holy Land, which I have not, but I've been told, Jerusalem is in the mountains. So it's the highest point all around. And so no matter where you're at, when you go to Jerusalem, you go up the mountain. Jerusalem is God's holy city. It had been in the time of the Old Testament. But in the prophets, it takes on this image of the place where God will one day rule with his people. A place where his glory will be displayed, and all the nations will come to his mountain to worship and be with him. And so in Revelation, it's not just a coronation banquet, it's also a feast of a wedding, because God will one day be reunited with his people. The Garden of Eden was a place where God and humans dwelt together, where God's space and our space overlapped. But when humans rebelled, we could no longer be in God's space. But in the new heavens and the new earth, we will once again be with God in his space. And in that place, there will be no death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. So if we were to go back a couple chapters in Revelation, there's this story of God resurrecting all of his saints. And so if you've been to a funeral liturgy that we do, we talk about waiting and resting until the resurrection. When God will return, Jesus will return and resurrect his people. And he will restore the earth, and we will be with him in the new heavens and the new earth. Death has no power over our God. Death is the result of sin. It's the result of rebellion. It's the result of chaos and evil. But God is a God of order and purpose. He made the world to have order and purpose, but we've destroyed that. But the story of the Bible is God remaking the world. He set out to make all things new. He set out to defeat death. So when his work is complete, death will be done away with forever. Because death has no power over our God. So what is the Bible's view of death? The Bible views death as a plague. It views it as an illness as a result of human rebellion, of evil, and chaos. But the hope of the Bible isn't that we will one day escape this death-forsaken world. Not that we will escape and go somewhere else, but that God will return and restore this world and remake it. Because death has no power over our God. But what does this mean while we wait for Jesus' return? What it means is we must wait. And if you've ever been to one of my funerals, I say we wait, and while we wait, we will face death. But we don't face death without hope, because we know that death has no power over our God. But still, death is a tragedy. And it won't go down without a fight. And so that's why we face death in this life. Now, what about the people who we've lost? The way I like to talk about this is that when we lose someone, they go to rest with Jesus. Now, there's one place in the Bible when Jesus talks to that thief on the cross, in I think the Gospel of Luke specifically, when the one thief curses Jesus, the other thief says, "How could you say that? He doesn't deserve death like the rest of us." And then Jesus looks to that man and he says, "You will be with me today in paradise." That's the one clue. And also Paul talks about one day going to be with God, with Jesus, apart from his body, but resting with the Lord. So we don't know what to say about the people who have passed. Other than that, I believe they are with Jesus, they are resting, they are waiting with the rest of us for Jesus to return. It's a good place to be. It's not a bad place, but it's waiting like the rest of us, waiting for Jesus to return to restore all things. Because death has no power over our God. He's already won, and the day is coming when death will be swallowed up forever. But we do face death. Our loved ones and each of us face death. So I don't want to minimize that pain. It's real. It's the worst part about life. And so on Saints' Day, we recognize that pain and that loss. But we realize that those whom we love who are in Christ Jesus are resting and waiting. And that we can look to them as a faithful witness to how to live while we wait, either for Jesus to return or while we live this life. And we can know that death has no power over our God.